Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday everybody. I hope you've had a productive week and I wish you a restful weekend ahead. I am out of the office today, so I'm filming this in a different location. There's a bit of an echo in here. My apologies, hopefully it is not too distracting. With that said, let's begin, and we begin today's video with the NATO summit in Washington this week. A lot happened at the event, but for our purposes, we will just examine the China-related comments. The declaration from the NATO summit said in paragraph 4, quote, "Deepening strategic partnership between Russia and the PRC and their mutually reinforcing attempts to undercut and reshape the rules-based international order are a cause for profound concern," end quote. Adding in paragraph 26, quote, "The PRC has become a divisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine through its so-called no-limits partnership and its large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base," end quote, and that it, quote, "cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting its interests and reputation," end quote. And then in paragraph 27, quote, "The PRC continues to pose systemic challenges to Euro-Atlantic security. We have seen sustained malicious cyber and hybrid activities, including disinformation stemming from the PRC," end quote. We remember earlier this week, Australia published a report on alleged PRC malign cyber operations, which the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Germany, Japan and South Korea all also signed on to. Paragraph 30 then demonstrated that NATO is also interested in the Asia-Pacific. Quote, "The Indo-Pacific is important for NATO, given that developments in that region directly affect Euro-Atlantic security," end quote. The comments of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken are also noteworthy. Quote, "So as we're gathering here in Washington with our Indo-Pacific partners, what this means is that we're breaking down the silos between Europe, Asia, and the United States. And this has been a very deliberate objective, not only building convergence with our allies, stronger convergence when it comes to how to approach Russia, and in a different way, how to approach China, but also breaking down the barriers, the walls between European partners and Asian partners. China is being the major contributor to Russia's defense industrial base. 70% of the machine tools that Russia is importing are coming from China. 90% of the microelectronics that Russia is importing are coming from China. And that's enabled it to sustain its aggression against Ukraine," end quote. In an interesting piece too, today US-based CNN reports that NATO officials are discussing taking action to reclaim some Chinese-owned infrastructure projects in Europe should a wider conflict with Russia break out in the east of the continent. 3 officials involved in the discussions told the outlet. The fear, according to one US official, is that Beijing could use the infrastructure it owns in Europe to provide material assistance to Russia if the conflict were to expand. The goal, officials said, is to figure out a path forward well in advance of any potential conflict. The discussions on taking action on infrastructure, according to 3 officials involved in them, are still in the early stages and have seen varying levels of involvement among the NATO member countries. One NATO diplomat suggested that the US, which is spearheading the discussions, would need to pursue the discussions on a bilateral basis to secure the necessary support. Of course, Beijing is not happy about any of this, particularly the NATO statement. Yesterday, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian called NATO's Washington summit declaration a, quote, "scaremongering piece about the Asia-Pacific, a product of the Cold War mentality and full of belligerent rhetoric. Its paragraphs on China contain a load of biases, smears and provocations. We strongly deplore and firmly oppose it and have lodged a serious protest to NATO," end quote. He then demanded that NATO, quote, "discard the Cold War mentality, block confrontation and zero-sum approach, form the right perspective of China, stop interfering in China's internal affairs and vilifying China, and stop disturbing China-Europe relations. Don't bring instability to the Asia-Pacific after it has been done so to Europe," end quote. By after it has done so to Europe, Beijing means starting the war in Ukraine. State media has also come out swinging with a series of fiery commentaries attacking NATO. Evidently, the NATO points struck a nerve in Beijing. A state-run Global Times editorial argued yesterday, quote, "Now the US is shifting most conflicts in the world towards China, and NATO is also following suit to strengthen its competitive stance against China. This not only arouses opposition from countries in the Asia-Pacific region, but also complaints within European states. Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, which holds the current rotating presidency of the EU Council, recently warned in the American magazine Newsweek that if NATO chooses conflict instead of cooperation and war instead of peace, it will be committing suicide. If NATO continues to rely on its counter-trend approach to sustain existence, especially in pursuit of the bloc's globalization, its accelerated failure is inevitable," end quote. And in a state-run China Daily editorial today, quote, "Actually, it is NATO itself that should be blamed for the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. China has been and will always be a contributor to global development and a defender of the international order," end quote. Next up, UK-based Carbon Brief has published its May report, and its comments on China are noteworthy. The institute reports that clean energy generated a record high 44% of China's electricity in May 2024, pushing coal's share down to a record low of 53%, despite continued growth in demand. Coal lost 7 percentage points compared with May 2023, when it accounted for 60% of generation in China. Quote, "New findings show a continuation of recent trends, which helped send China's carbon dioxide (CO2) emissions from fossil fuels and cement into reverse in March 2024. If current rapid wind and solar deployment continues, then China's CO2 output is likely to continue falling, making 2023 the peak year for the country's emissions," end quote. On this theme, yesterday, Thursday, US-based Global Energy Monitor published a report called "China Continues to Lead the World in Wind and Solar, with twice as much capacity under construction as the rest of the world combined." The NGO found that China has 180 gigawatts of utility-scale solar power under construction and 15 gigawatts of wind power. That brings the total of wind and solar power under construction to 339 gigawatts, well ahead of the 40 gigawatts under construction in the United States. The researchers only looked at solar farms with a capacity of 20 megawatts or more, which feed directly into the grid. That means that the total volume of solar power in China could be much higher, as small-scale solar farms account for about 40% of China's solar capacity. The report writes, quote, "China added almost twice as much utility-scale solar and wind power capacity in 2023 than any other year. Wind and solar now account for 37% of the total power capacity in the country, an 8% increase from 2022, and widely expected to surpass coal capacity, which is 39% of the total right now, in 2024. Although there is fast growth in power storage capacity, China's grid heavily relies on coal power to mitigate the intermittency of renewables, casting a shadow on wind and solar achievements. For example, in the plan for the second wave of mega wind and solar bases for the period of the 14th five-year plan, 2021 through 2025, 30% of the proposed capacity is actually from coal power," end quote. Next up, global views on China. But just quickly, if you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are all tremendous helps for the channel. It's the only way to keep the algorithm happy, so this channel gets shown to new people. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. I rely primarily on subscriber support to keep the channel going. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Finally, for today, this week, US-based Pew Research published a new survey on the views towards China from 35 countries. Large majorities in nearly all the countries they polled, spanning 6 continents and ranging in income level, say China has a great deal or a fair amount of influence on their country's economic conditions. And China's economic influence is now felt more widely than it was when they last asked this question in 2019. In 10 of the 13 countries where trend data is available, a larger share say China has a great deal of impact on their country's economy than said so 5 years ago. But whether people see this influence as positive or negative varies widely. In most of the middle-income countries included in the survey, people tend to view China's economic influence as a good thing. But in high-income countries, people tend to see it as a bad thing. In the 17 middle-income countries surveyed, a median of 47% of adults say China has a positive influence on their country's economy, while 29% say it has a negative impact. In the 18 high-income countries surveyed, a median of 57% of adults say China's economic influence is negative, while 28% say it's positive. This divergence is significant and could have a material impact on geopolitical movements going forward. Let's end today by examining some of the survey, which we're now quoting selected excerpts from directly. Across the 35 countries we surveyed, more have unfavorable views of China than favorable ones. The same is true when it comes to President Xi Jinping. People mostly lack confidence in him to do the right thing regarding world affairs. A 35-country median of 35% have a favorable view of China, compared with a median of 52% who have a negative view. Opinions vary widely, from 11% favorable in Sweden to 80% favorable in Thailand. In the 18 high-income countries we polled, views of China are, on balance, negative. There are three notable exceptions where opinion of China are either divided or net positive: Chile, Greece, and Singapore. Among Singaporeans, those who are ethnically Chinese are particularly favorable, 71%. A majority of Singaporeans who are not ethnically Chinese also see China favorably, 59%. In the 17 middle-income countries we polled, views of China are much rosier, though three countries stand out as having more negative than positive views: India, the Philippines, and Turkey. Americans are the most likely to have a negative view of China's economic impact. About three-quarters say China's influence on the US economy is negative. Where views on China's economic influence have changed, they have generally become more negative. In Argentina, Brazil, Israel, Japan, South Korea, and Tunisia, more say China has a negative economic influence on their country than said so in 2019. Overall favorability of China follows a similar pattern to views of its economic influence. Across the high-income countries surveyed, a median of 70% view China unfavorably. Across the middle-income countries surveyed, a median of 56% view China favorably. China launched its Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Today, more than 10 years into the initiative, the country's global outward foreign direct investment is close to $3 trillion. At the same time, controversies have arisen about the environmental impact of Chinese firms operating abroad, how their workers are treated, and even whether Chinese investments benefit local economies or act as harmful competition. Still, people in a number of middle-income nations have a positive impression of Chinese companies operating there. Across the 9 nations where we asked about this, a 72% median said Chinese companies are good for their country's economy. Views are most positive in Thailand, 81%, Kenya, 80%, and Bangladesh, 79%, though a majority or plurality hold this view in each of the 9 surveyed countries. When it comes to whether Chinese companies work to protect the environment in these countries, opinion is a bit cooler. A median of 63% say Chinese companies do work to protect the environment. Opinion is even more mixed on whether Chinese companies in each country treat local workers fairly. In Ghana, Nigeria, the Philippines, and South Africa, around 4 in 10 or more do not think Chinese companies operating in their country treat local workers fairly. China's territorial disputes concern many in Asia-Pacific countries. China is party to multiple territorial disputes in the Asia-Pacific region, whether related to the South China Sea, the East China Sea, or even specific boundaries such as those between India and China. Of the 10 Asia-Pacific countries we surveyed, majorities or pluralities in all but Thailand are at least somewhat concerned about these territorial disputes. In the Philippines, for example, where border tensions with China largely center on the Second Thomas Shoal of the Spratly Islands, 91% say that they're concerned about territorial disputes between China and its neighbors, including 65% who are very concerned. Around 3/4 or more in Australia, Japan, Malaysia, and South Korea also express concern. In the Asia-Pacific, views differ on whether China contributes to global peace and stability. Across the Asia-Pacific region, we also asked people whether China contributes to peace and stability around the world. Opinion is divided. In Malaysia and Thailand, around 2/3 or more see it as playing this role. About 3 in 10 or fewer say the same in Australia, India, Japan, and South Korea. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a great Friday. Have a restful weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.